I mentioned a few times in our discussions on the soul that the English translations sometimes do render the Hebrew and Greek words for the soul in ways that show you that it's mortal and show you that the soul is the person rather than some separatable, or maybe more accurately, separable part of the person. Often that's the case because a passage wouldn't make any sense if you translated it in some other way other than the word soul, even if you are trying, consciously or unconsciously, to avoid the conclusion that the soul's mortal or that the soul is just the person. You'll especially see this in the King James Version, which is the principal version I'm using going through these verses. There's times in the King James Version where the translators very clearly, again, whether consciously or unconsciously, covered up the idea that the soul was being referred to by referring to it as the person or the life, as we talked about in the last class that we had. And there's other places where they could have translated it the very same way as a person to try to avoid the conclusion that it's talking about the soul. And they chose to translate it as the soul. So the King James Version in particular, which I should stress, I do believe is the greatest of all the English translations, does have some very strange motivations behind its translation in terms of some words like the Hebrew word nephesh or Greek word psyche translated soul. In this session, I want to give you some examples of how the King James Version has translated those words as soul in the Bible in places that clearly demonstrate that the soul is not inherently immortal. I've said that so many times that I'm assuming you know what I mean by that, but I'll briefly explain that expression just for the sake of anyone newer to this series. When we talk about something being inherently immortal, we mean that immortality is just part of what it is to be that kind of being. Certainly, I think everyone would say that God is inherently immortal, that the fact that he is God and the type of God that he is assumes that he is immortal, and certainly the Bible describes him in that way. But because of the massive influence of Greek philosophy, as well as Babylonish and Egyptian concepts that crept into the thinking of the church, as well as even earlier into the thinking of some Jews prior to the New Testament period, there have been ideas among God's people about the soul of humans being immortal. And today, in our modern day, after centuries of those ideas taking root in the minds of people, and being repeated and repeated and repeated, and the terrible, devastating power of false tradition anchoring them deeper into people's thinking, we're now in a day where the vast majority of Christians believe the human soul is inherently immortal, that it's just part of being a human being that you'd have an immortal soul. But as we've seen, that is absolutely not what the Bible teaches. So I started saying I think it's interesting that in the King James Version, which was translated by men that undoubtedly believed the human soul was immortal and undoubtedly did cover up that fact, again, they may not have done it consciously. Maybe it was just their unconscious theological bias that caused them to do it. But they undoubtedly covered up that fact, as we've seen, by translating it in a number of other ways other than the word soul, so it wouldn't look like a soul was dying or a soul was mortal, by translating it as a person died or they gave up their life or whatever the case might be, like in the previous sessions we talked about. But interestingly, there are a number of places in the Bible where they did directly translate the word nephesh, the Hebrew word for soul, or the word psyche, the Greek word for soul, as soul, in statements that completely contradict the doctrinal beliefs of those translators. It seems completely mysterious that they would do that, but I believe it's very likely that God was not going to allow them to translate every example of the word soul where it describes the soul as just the person, again, not some separatable part of them, or it describes the soul as being mortal and dying when the person dies, which is pretty obvious. If the soul is the person themselves and if the person dies, the soul dies. I think God wasn't going to allow them to universally translate those words for the soul in those kind of passages in ways that would cover them up, because he wanted us to see examples in the Bible, in these English translations, where the soul is described as mortal, the soul is described as dying, the soul is described as just the person themselves, which, if we're studious enough, would cause us to dig deeper, which is exactly what we're trying to do with this series of classes and what we'll likely put in a book form. To go through and see what the Bible really says about the soul, and to demonstrate that the human soul is just a human being in the fullest and deepest sense of what makes up the identity of that being. That's a bit of repetition from things I've said before, but to get anyone caught up or anyone new to this series, all that said, I'll give you some examples. All the examples I'm going to give you in this session, and it may bleed over into another session, are going to be examples of times when the King James Version, and other English translations as well, but that's the one we're going to focus on, When the King James Version translators did translate the Hebrew or Greek words for the soul as the soul in passages that are contradictory to the type of theology they held about the soul being immortal or the soul being some part of the person that can be taken out of that person and continue living on. So let's wade into some of the scriptures. One of the first examples in the Bible is in Leviticus 23:30. This is a warning about the judgment that will occur if somebody breaks the Sabbath. It says, "Whatsoever soul it be that doeth any work in that same day, the same soul will I destroy from among his people." This verse not only attests to the soul being the person themselves and not some separable part of a person, it also demonstrates that the soul can be destroyed. The Hebrew word abad here, translated as destroy, refers to being lost or perishing. Though I'm sure some might try to attempt to avoid the conclusion that that means that souls will be destroyed under God's judgment, that they'll perish, by arguing that this just means they would be lost spiritually. Those assumptions are easily dismissed by the fact of what happened to the very first man who broke this injunction. It's recorded in Numbers 15:32-36, the last couple verses of which tell us exactly what God meant by a soul being destroyed from among the people if they broke the Sabbath. The 35th and 36th verse says, "The Lord said unto Moses, The man shall be surely put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones without the camp. And all the congregation brought him without the camp and stoned him with stones, and he died, as the Lord commanded Moses." Clearly what was being referred to back in Leviticus 23:30, that if a soul, a person, breaks the Sabbath, that soul, that person, would be destroyed from among the people. He isn't just talking about them being separated out somewhere, like the concept of what some believe is the case with eternal judgment. They believe eternal judgment is an eternal, ongoing, never-ending, experiential punishment of being continually burned throughout all eternity. And those who believe that kind of idea about eternal judgment also often hold to the idea that whenever the Bible is talking about the wicked being killed or destroyed, it doesn't really mean death or destruction like we think of it. It just means they'll be separated from God because they'll be out there away from God being tormented through all eternity. That's not what those words mean in the Old or the New Testament. That is just an attempt to try to continue teaching a doctrine about eternal conscious torment that's not supported by the vast majority of the statements about judgment in the Bible, which refer to judgment being death and destruction that has a finality to it. It's not an unending process of death and destruction. This man wasn't continually stoned forevermore because he broke the Sabbath. He was stoned until he died. And that's what the judgment is. The soul that sinneth, it shall surely die. Moving on to some more passages where we see the soul described in ways that clearly attest to its mortality, its ability to die. I'll give you a number of them in the 10th chapter of Joshua. In the 28th verse, it says, "That day Joshua took Makkedah and smote it with the edge of the sword, and the king thereof he utterly destroyed, them and all the souls that were therein. He let none remain. And he did to the king of Makkedah as he did unto the king of Jericho." 2 verses later, in 10:30, it says, "The Lord delivered it also, and the king thereof, into the hand of Israel, and he smote it with the edge of the sword, and all the souls that were therein, he let none remain in it, but did unto the king thereof as he did unto the king of Jericho," which, by the way, is talking about killing him, and thus he killed them. Joshua 10:32 says, "The Lord delivered Lachish into the hand of Israel, which took it on the second day and smote it with the edge of the sword, and all the souls that were therein, according to all that he had done to Libnah." Now that's talking about smiting them with the edge of the sword, killing them. 10:35 says, "They took it on that day and smote it with the edge of the sword, and all the souls that were therein he utterly destroyed that day, according to all that he had done at Lachish." Now again, you notice that he's utterly destroying souls. Something that many Christians have been deceived into believing can't be destroyed because they're indestructible and eternal. That's why, by the way, they argue, having been heavily influenced by Greek philosophical ideas about the soul, that since the soul cannot be destroyed, it cannot die. According to them, if it's the soul of a wicked person, the soul has to be tormented throughout eternity because a soul can never come to an end. But this is obviously talking about souls being destroyed in the sense that they are not continually being destroyed from that point forward. They are destroyed, and their life and existence is over with. 2 verses later, in 10:37, it says, "They took it and smote it with the edge of the sword, and the king thereof and all the cities thereof, and all the souls that were therein. He left none remaining." If it wasn't clear enough what destroyed meant in the 35th verse, the 37th verse uses the same kind of expression for what's done to souls, and it says none are left remaining. If the soul lived on, it would still be remaining. Again, this points directly at the problem with some people's conception of eternal judgment and eternal conscious torment, because the whole idea of their belief is if a soul cannot die, and the judgment God intends for the souls of the wicked is for them to be tormented throughout eternity, they have to remain. You'd have to remain in existence. But the Bible explains that when souls are destroyed or slain, they are not remaining. There's nothing remaining. The soul is the person. When the person dies, the soul dies. And it goes on to say, by the way, right after that he did it according to all that he had done at Eglon and destroyed it utterly and all the souls that were in. If it wasn't strong enough to say he destroyed the city and the souls, it expands on it even more heavily to say he destroyed it utterly. 2 verses later in Joshua 10:39, it says he took it and the king thereof and all the cities thereof, and they smote it with the edge of the sword and utterly destroyed all the souls that were therein. There's that utter, complete destruction again. If the souls were still living on somewhere, they wouldn't be utterly destroyed, would they? He left none remaining, as he had done to Hebron, so did he to Debir, and to the king thereof, as he had done also to Libnah, and to her king. I'll give you one more example in Joshua, in the 11th chapter, the 11th verse. It says, they smote all the souls that were therein with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was not any left to breathe, and he burnt Hazor with fire. So what does it mean when a soul's destroyed? You realize we're addressing two different things here. We're addressing the nature of the soul, but we're also addressing the nature of eternal judgment. Because if God warns that the wicked are going to be destroyed, he does. He says the wicked are going to die, he does say that. This is how they die. There's not any left to breathe, which means they are not still continuing in some kind of state of existence. So, the preceding examples in Joshua 10 and 11 are some of the few examples in which the King James Version translators mysteriously, as I said, decide to override their own theological biases and translate a passage in a way that shows that souls can be destroyed. The Hebrew states that Joshua smote and utterly destroyed all the souls, and he let none remain. That statement makes no sense whatsoever if the soul is some immortal element of an individual that leaves the physical body at death. But if the soul is the innermost expression of the person, or even a more general expression of the complete, unique individual themselves, then killing the individual would kill the soul. It would kill that unique individual being, just as these passages state. Moving on to some other passages, and I'll give you a few in 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel 24:11 says, I have not sinned against thee, yet thou huntest my soul to take it. Which, if you look at the context, is obviously not talking about him taking it and doing something with it. It's talking about him taking his life. 1 Samuel 25:29 says, Yet a man is risen to pursue thee and to seek thy soul. But the soul of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of life with the Lord thy God, and the souls of thine enemies, them shall he sling out, as out of the middle of a sling. Now that is highly poetic language that somebody could get carried away with and come up with some strange theological position. But if you're really paying attention, it tells us something pretty important that, as all these verses, supports the conception of the soul that I've been teaching. Notice it says, the soul of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of life with the Lord thy God. That's not talking about after his death. That means right now. There's somebody trying to seek his soul, which, by the way, when you see that expression, it's not talking about somebody trying to corrupt your soul. You can't spiritualize that into some meaning that would not have been contextual, that someone's just trying to corrupt his soul or seek it in some spiritual sense, that I want to have some kind of influence over him. That is an expression that is undeniably talking about trying to kill somebody in some literal physical sense. And notice that he says that his soul would be bound in the bundle of life with the Lord, which is to say that God would protect him from that person taking his life. That's, again, not talking about something after his death. 1 Samuel 26:21, and we'll tie that into the 24th verse of that chapter as well. It says, Then said Saul, I have sinned. Return my son David, for I will no more do thee harm, because my soul was precious in thine eyes this day. Behold, I've played the fool, and have erred exceedingly. Then the 24th verse says, And behold, as thy life was much set by this day in mine eyes, so let my life be much set by in the eyes of the Lord, and let him deliver me out of all tribulation. The two examples of the word life in the 24th verse are both the word for the soul. So it's interesting that in the 21st verse, the King James translators translated nephesh as soul as it should be translated. And they're talking about how it was precious in his eyes, which is just to say he didn't take his life, his soul. He didn't slay him and thus end his soul life. But then when we get to the 24th verse, they shift and decide to translate the same exact word a different way as life in both of its cases. Saul's essentially saying, my soul life, my very existence, was precious in your eyes. If David had killed him, his soul would have died. Or more accurately, he would have died as a soul. He would have been a dead soul. The life of Saul's soul, his very existence, was precious enough to David that he didn't take it. That's proved by the 24th verse, where the translators translated the word nephesh, which is the same word for the soul, as life in both examples of that word in that verse. 1 Kings 1:29 says, the king sware and said, as the Lord liveth, that hath redeemed my soul out of all distress. David's referring to all the times that God delivered him from death during his lifetime. That means that the idea of the soul being redeemed can refer to a person's life being protected from death in this temporal pre-eternal period, in a slightly different way than the idea we think of our souls being redeemed from future judgment. Both are true. Though the redemption of the soul might also refer to eternal redemption, David was obviously speaking of the many times God redeemed his life in the face of the many temporal mortal threats he experienced. Moving on to the book of Job. Job 27:8 says, what is the hope of the hypocrite, though he hath gained, when God taketh away his soul? This isn't talking about God taking a soul out of a person's body and putting it somewhere, as some people believe happens with the righteous, and some even believe happens with the unrighteous. Instead, this is a highly poetic way of saying that God will take away the life of the wicked man, and thus that the soul that is that person will end. A wicked man will end his existence when God takes his life. In contrast, by the way, a man in relationship with the Lord will end their temporal existence as well, but they will live again. Job 33:18 says, he keepeth back his soul from the pit, and his life from perishing by the sword. The parallel going on here is between the soul and the life, meaning when your life ends, your soul ends. If your life is going to perish and your soul would be in the pit, but just referring to the grave, then they have to be talking about the same essential element. Job 33:21-22 says, his flesh is consumed away that it cannot be seen, and his bones that were not seen stick out. Yea, his soul draweth near unto the grave, and his life to the destroyers. Notice again that this is paralleling the soul and the life. What's interesting about this, which is just 3 to 4 verses after the last example, it has the same parallels between the soul and the life. In 18, it was referring to the soul going down to the pit, which is the grave, and the life perishing. In this passage, just like the 18th verse I just quoted previously, we again see the soul drawing near to the grave and the person's life to the destroyers, which just parallels the fact that when you lose your life, you lose your soul in the sense that your soul life ends. 6 verses later, in Job 33:28, he says, he will deliver his soul from going into the pit, and his life shall see the light. Again, this same kind of parallel. And 2 verses later, in 33:30, he says to bring back his soul from the pit to be enlightened with the light of the living. The soul is equated with the person's life in all of those passages in Job 33. And thus, if a person's life ends, their soul life ends. If a person's physical life is taken by the sword, his soul will die. If his life is destroyed, the soul is destroyed. The soul's destination is the grave or the pit, which are referring to the same thing, meaning that the soul that is the person themselves will be dead and buried. It's not alive somewhere. It doesn't outlive the body. In fact, it isn't anything that's able to be constitutionally separated from the body. It's just the person themselves. Though the last two examples in Job 33:28 and 30 might be taken figuratively for spiritual life, the overall context implies they're speaking of the same thing that the passages that preceded them were talking about. That if the person dies, their soul dies. And as a dead soul, a dead person, they then go down to the pit or the grave. Moving on to a few examples in the Psalms. Psalm 6:3-5 says, my soul is also sore vexed, but thou, O Lord, how long? Return, O Lord, deliver my soul. O save me for thy mercy's sake. Notice what he's worried about his soul being saved from. For in death there is no remembrance of thee, In the grave, who shall give thee thanks? David is appealing to God to deliver his soul from death, which again would be insensible if the soul is inherently immortal. If there's any doubt he's referring to the death of his physical body equating to the death of his soul, that should be overcome by the fact that he pleads with God to deliver his soul from death and the grave. And notice, by the way, that he says, in death there is no remembrance of thee, which means even a man like David, who clearly was someone who was going to receive a resurrection, is not going to be in some conscious state after he dies. His soul will be out of conscious existence, or else there still would be remembrance of God in the afterlife. Psalm 7, 1-5 is a Shiggaion of David, which he sang unto the Lord concerning the words of Cush the Benjamite. Says, O Lord my God, in thee do I put my trust. Save me from all them that persecute me, and deliver me, lest he tear my soul like a lion, rending it in pieces, while there is none to deliver. O Lord my God, if I have done this, if there be iniquity in my hands, if I have rewarded evil unto him that was at peace with me, yea, I have delivered him that without cause is mine enemy, let the enemy persecute my soul and take it. Yea, let him tread down my life upon the earth and lay mine honor in the dust. Selah. To David, tearing his physical body in pieces is synonymous with tearing his soul, and the enemy persecuting and taking his soul is paralleled with treading down his life, with killing him. Thus, a threat to the physical body is a threat to the soul that's the person whose body is being threatened. Psalm 16:10 says, For thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. The word translated as hell in the King James Version is Sheol, which refers to the grave, not to some place of burning, destructive judgment. This messianic statement about Jesus is clear evidence that the soul, which is the person, dies and is buried when the person is. Notice how Peter expanded on this verse in the second chapter of Acts 2, 23-31. Talking about Jesus, he says, Him, being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, ye have taken, and by wicked hands have crucified and slain, whom God hath raised up, having loosed the pains of death, because it was not possible that he should be holden of it. For David speaketh concerning him, I foresaw the Lord always before my face, for he is on my right hand that I should not be moved. Therefore did my heart rejoice, and my tongue was glad. Moreover also my flesh shall rest in hope, because thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. Thou hast made known to me the ways of life. Thou shalt make me full of joy with thy countenance. Men and brethren, let me freely speak unto you of the patriarch David, that he is both dead and buried, and his sepulchre is with us unto this day. Therefore, being a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him, that of the fruit of his loins, according to the flesh, he would raise up Christ to sit on his throne, he, seeing this before, spake of the resurrection of Christ, that his soul was not left in hell, neither his flesh did see corruption. The preceding statements by Peter and the passage he's quoting and teaching on prove that when a person who's a soul dies, they are a dead soul, and that the dead soul, which is a dead person, is then buried in the grave. This is exactly what happened to Jesus. He was a living soul, a living being. Again, let me stress, you cannot use the expression living soul to refer to some specialized spiritual state someone's in, that now they're alive to God, so they're a living soul. You need a different term for that if that's what you're trying to say, that someone who has the Holy Spirit or has been saved from their past sins is now alive to God. You have to stop calling that type of person a living soul, because in the Bible, any physically living person is already called by that title. So you're going to have to come up with a new title, and forgive me, but cease and desist from using the expression living soul in a way the Bible does not use it. So let me say this again. This is what happened to Jesus. He was a living soul, a living being who died, and thus he became a dead soul, a dead being, who was then buried in the grave, which is the word Hades in the New Testament Greek, and that's intended to have the very same meaning as the word Sheol in the Old Testament Hebrew. It's just the grave. His soul wasn't alive somewhere. Your soul's not alive in the grave. How horrifying would that be if your soul was alive in a coffin or in a hole in the ground that you've been buried in under the dirt? His soul and his flesh, his body, that was the external expression of the person that he was, the soul that he was, didn't remain in a state of death and decay, but were raised back to life. Not as a bodiless soul in heaven, and not in some soul form awaiting a body, but as a soul always has been, as a being with a body. There's no such thing as a bodiless soul. Every living soul is a living being with a living body, just as every dead soul is a dead being, which is a result of being a dead body. Psalm 17:13 says, "Arise, O Lord, disappoint him, cast him down. Deliver my soul from the wicked, which is thy sword." Psalms 22:20 says, "Deliver my soul from the sword, my darling, from the power of the dog." Both of those verses refer to the sword being a threat to the soul. The first is more figurative in nature, but the second's an appeal to be delivered from the swords of the Gentiles. If the soul was an immaterial, separable part of the human being that couldn't be harmed by physical threats, then these types of statements would be meaningless. But the soul is simply the person themselves, and if the person's physically attacked and they're killed, the soul that they are will die. Psalms 22:29 says, "All they that go down to the dust shall bow before him, and none can keep alive his own soul." If none can keep alive his own soul, the soul can't be inherently immortal, since if it were, then keeping it alive wouldn't be an issue. Instead, this is saying that no one's able to keep themselves from eventually dying, and when they do so, it will be a complete death. No part of the human being will remain alive when his body dies. Psalms 25, 1-2, and then I'll jump down to 25:20. This is a Psalm of David. He says, "Unto thee, O Lord, do I lift up my soul. O my God, I trust in thee. Let me not be ashamed. Let not mine enemies triumph over me." Now in the 20th verse says, "O keep my soul and deliver me. Let me not be ashamed, for I put my trust in thee." I prayed that psalm more times than I could possibly count during the crisis I was going through with terminal cancer. And God heard my plea and brought me up from that state that I was in. David, in this case, appealing to God to protect him from his enemies' threats against his life. It's his soul that he desires God to protect and keep from their attacks, which would, again, be insensible if the soul can't be hurt by human people. Again, going back to what I said in the last session, the statement Jesus made in Matthew 10:28 thus cannot mean that a human being cannot end your soul life. They can end your soul life, as we've seen in Scripture after Scripture after Scripture. Thus, what Jesus has to mean is they cannot permanently end your soul life, which when you think of God's perspective of time and space and of reality, you'd have to realize that even if an enemy ends our soul life, if God intends to bring us back to life, our soul life to him hasn't been ended. That's what has confused people so much, because they hear statements about how your soul will not die, and yet lots of Christians have died. And if you're going to be faithful to what the Bible actually says, you would have to also believe their souls died, because when a person dies, their soul dies. The soul is the person, as we've seen, as I said, over and over again. So what does it mean that the soul will not die? It doesn't mean the soul will never experience temporal death. It means the soul will not die from God's perspective. So if you were to die and lay there for a century, that's no time at all to God. But it's not just the time between it. It's the fact that if God intends to restore you to life, your death, which is actual true death, is not really death from his perspective. It's just a pausing of your conscious existence until he awakes you, which is exactly why, I'm sure we'll talk about this in greater detail later on when we talk about the state of death and the afterlife. It's exactly why he talks about death as sleep when he's talking about the death of his people. Because to him, even though you are dead, you're just asleep. Because unlike those he doesn't intend to give a resurrection, if he intends to give you a resurrection, your death is not really death. It's just a pause in your conscious existence until he reawakens you to conscious life. That is the simple meaning of the statements people get so caught up in the New Testament, where he's promising them life and that they won't have to die. If that's really what he meant, that they truly would not have to die, it had to be awfully shocking when their bodies were killed. And if all these scriptures we're reading are true about what happens when the body is killed, that the soul dies, that cannot be what he meant. He meant you will not be dead from his perspective. You will just be in a state where your conscious life is paused. Yes, it's death to us, but that's not death to God. Death to God is permanent death. Anything less than permanent death is just sleep from his perspective, because it's something he is going to awake us from. As I said, I'll get into, I'm sure, a lot more detail on that a little later down the line on this subject. We talk about the afterlife and sleep and other things. Psalms 26:9 says, "Gather not my soul with sinners, nor my life with bloody men." The Hebrew word asaph, which is translated as gather here, refers to taking something away or destroying it. David doesn't want to be numbered among the sinful and violent and to have his life, his soul, taken from him by the judgment of God. Psalms 30 verse 3 says, O Lord, thou hast brought up my soul from the grave. Thou hast kept me alive, that I should not go down to the pit. His soul being brought up from the pit and the grave are poetic ways of saying that God kept him, or more precisely, his soul from dying, which is further reinforced by his statement that thou hast kept me alive. Psalms 33:18-20 says, Behold, the eye of the Lord is upon them that fear him, upon them that hope in his mercy, to deliver their soul from death, and to keep them alive in famine. Our soul waiteth for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. Delivering a person's soul from death is a reference to protecting their soul from dying, which by itself proves that the soul can die. And this isn't referring to delivering their soul from ever dying in the future, because they'll supposedly go to heaven at death. This is referring to them being protected from dying as a result of this famine or other life-threatening conditions that were going on at that time. The 35th Psalm has multiple examples in it. I'll read the 1st through the 13th verse, but I'll also run down to the 17th and the 25th. This is a Psalm of David. He said, Plead my cause, O Lord, with them that strive with me. Fight against them that fight against me. Take hold of shield and buckler, and stand up for mine help. Draw out also the spear, and stop the way against them that persecute me. Say unto my soul, I am thy salvation. Let them be confounded and put to shame that seek after my soul. Let them be turned back and brought to confusion that devise my hurt. Let them be as chaff before the wind, and let the angel of the Lord chase them. Let their way be dark and slippery, and let the angel of the Lord persecute them. For without cause have they hid for me their net in a pit, which without cause they have digged for my soul. Let destruction come upon him at unawares, and let his net that he hath hid catch himself. Into that very destruction let him fall. And my soul shall be joyful in the Lord, it shall rejoice in his salvation. All my bones shall say, Lord, who is like unto thee, which deliverest the poor from him that is too strong for him, yea, the poor and the needy from him that spoileth him? False witnesses did rise up, they laid to my charge things that I knew not. They rewarded me evil for good to the spoiling of my soul. But as for me, when they were sick, my clothing was sackcloth. I humbled my soul with fasting, and my prayer returned unto mine own bosom. Down the 17th verse, he says, Lord, how long wilt thou look on? Rescue my soul from their destructions, my darling from the lions, which is to say something that's precious to me, from the lions. Then the 25th verse, he says, Let them not say in their hearts, Ah, so would we have it. Let them not say, We have swallowed him up. David appealed to God to save his soul from those who were seeking it, seeking to kill him, and thus to end his existence as a living soul. The phrase that's translated at the very end, so would we have it, is actually the Hebrew word nephesh, the word for the soul, and thus this might be intended to say, our souls will have what they want. In their case, what their souls wanted was to swallow David up. Psalms 40:14 says, Let them be ashamed and confounded together that seek after my soul to destroy it. Let them be driven backward and put to shame that wish me evil. If the soul is inherently immortal, no one can seek after it to destroy it. But anyone seeking to kill you is seeking to destroy your soul, since killing you as a person will kill the soul that you are as a person. Psalms 49:7-9 and the 15th verse. None of them can by any means redeem his brother, nor give to God a ransom for him. For the redemption of their soul is precious, and it ceaseth, it comes to an end, ends forever. That he should still live forever and not see corruption. Then the 15th verse says, But God will redeem my soul from the power of the grave, for he shall receive me. Selah. The Hebrew here in this passage is difficult to translate clearly into English, but the idea is that no man can redeem his brother from eventual death or give him eternal life, being able to live forever. Unless we're alive and remain and qualify as bride members when the Lord returns for his bride, we'll all see corruption. What I mean by that is we'll all experience death and decay. The soul, not just the body, has to be redeemed from death by the resurrection, or it will cease forever. That obviates the whole idea of the souls of the wicked being eternally tormented, since such a view contradicts this clear statement that the soul can cease. It can come to an end of its existence. Psalms 49:15 is referred to in Acts 2:27 and 2:31, where the Greek word psyche is used for the soul. In 2:27 he says, thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. In the 31st verse says, he seeing this before spake of the resurrection of Christ, that his soul was not left in hell, neither his flesh did see corruption. And again, that word translated hell there in both those cases is Hades, referring to the grave. Psalm 54, 1-7. This is another psalm of David. When the Zephims came and said to Saul, doth not David hide himself from us? He said, save me, O my God, by thy name, and judge me by thy strength. Hear my prayer, O God, give ear to the words of my mouth. For strangers are risen up against me, and oppressors seek after my soul. They have not set God before them. Behold, God is mine helper. The Lord is with them that uphold my soul. He shall reward evil unto mine enemies. Cut them off in thy truth. I will freely sacrifice unto thee. I will praise thy name, O Lord, for it is good. For he hath delivered me out of all trouble, and mine eye hath seen his desire upon mine enemies. David's enemies sought his life, and thus the destruction of his soul that would be accomplished by taking his life. Psalm 55, 16-18 says, as for me, I will call upon God, and the Lord shall save me. Evening and morning and at noon will I pray and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. He had delivered my soul in peace from the battle that was against me, for there were many with me. God delivered David's soul from being killed in battle. His soul would be killed if his physical body died in the battle. Psalms 56:6 says, they gather themselves together, they hide themselves, they mark my steps when they wait for my soul. That's just like the expression we read earlier, that an enemy can seek your soul. David's enemies were waiting to ambush him and kill him, and effectively would then have ended his existence as a living soul. Psalms 56:13 says, thou hast delivered my soul from death. Wilt not thou deliver my feet from falling, that I may walk before God in the light of the living? This is another example of the soul being delivered from temporal death. It's not a reference to escaping eternal death. In this psalm, David's reminiscing about how God had delivered him from the Philistines who might have otherwise killed him. If they had, David's soul would have died when they killed his body. The fact that he had the hope of a resurrection wouldn't have prevented that death. Other than the bride members who are alive at Jesus' coming, all will die at the soul level. And they'll have to be reconstituted in a resurrection if they die in a relationship with the Lord. Psalms 59, 2-3 says, deliver me from the workers of iniquity, and save me from bloody men. For lo, they lie in wait for my soul. The mighty are gathered against me. David's soul is endangered by these workers of iniquity and bloody men, who, if they took his life, would end his soul life. Psalm 63:9 says, those that seek my soul to destroy it shall go into the lower parts of the earth, meaning they're going to go in the grave themselves if they're seeking to kill David. Psalm 70, 1-2 is another psalm of David. He says, make haste, O God, to deliver me. Make haste to help me, O Lord. Let them be ashamed and confounded that seek after my soul. Let them be turned backward and put to confusion that desire my hurt. Psalm 71, 10-13 says, mine enemies speak against me, and they that lay wait for my soul take counsel together, saying, God hath forsaken him. Persecute and take him, for there is none to deliver him. O God, be not far from me. O my God, make haste for my help. Let them be confounded and consumed that are adversaries to my soul. Let them be covered with reproach and dishonor that seek my hurt. David wouldn't have any reason for concern about his enemies seeking his soul and laying in wait for it to destroy it if no human enemy could kill his soul. Psalm 78, 50-51, he made a way to his anger. He spared not their soul from death, but gave their life over to the pestilence. And he smote all the firstborn in Egypt, the chief of their strength in the tabernacles of Ham. This is another example of a proper translation of the Hebrew that, despite its obvious implications, is often completely missed by traditionalist scholars, usually by being read over without recognition of its theological import. The Egyptian firstborn who died in the last plague on Egypt didn't have their souls spared from death. Their souls died when their bodies died. That's because the body and soul are inseparable. They live as one, being a living soul, or they die as one, being a dead soul. To be a living soul, you have to be a living entity in a living body. If your body dies, then you die with it, and you're then a dead entity in a dead body. Psalms 86, 1-4, and then I'll jump down to 13-14. This is the prayer of David. Bow down thine ear, O Lord, hear me, for I am poor and needy. Preserve my soul, for I am holy. O thou my God, save thy servant that trusteth in thee. Be merciful unto me, O Lord, for I cry unto thee daily. Rejoice the soul of thy servant, for unto thee, O Lord, do I lift up my soul. Down the 13th and 14th verse, he says, For great is thy mercy toward me, and thou hast delivered my soul from the lowest hell. O God, the proud are risen against me, and the assemblies of violent men have sought after my soul, and have not set thee before them. This is another example of a passage that could be taken in figurative ways, in a spiritual sense rather than just literal. But the principal message is that of David appealing to God to protect his soul from the violent men who were seeking it. They were seeking it in the sense of seeking to take it from him by taking his life. In protecting him from them, God also delivered him from the lowest depths of the grave. The Hebrew word translated hell in the King James Version is Sheol, the grave. That's where he would have been if his enemies had killed him. Again, though this might have a secondary symbolic meaning, it undeniably is referring to God's protection of David's soul from the death and the grave his enemies sought for him. Psalms 88:3 says, For my soul is full of troubles, and my life draweth nigh unto the grave. Like the example we just read, this might be taken poetically for a feeling of hopelessness that's associated with all the troubles the psalmist was enduring, but it also conveys the idea that his soul was near unto death and associates his life with his soul. Psalms 89:48 says, What man is he that liveth and shall not see death? Shall he deliver his soul from the hand of the grave? If a man sees death, which just means experiences death, his soul goes down into the grave with his body. Figuratively speaking, the soul and the body are inseparable. The soul isn't alive after the death and burial of the body. It essentially experiences whatever the body does. If the body is buried, the person who's the soul is dead and buried. The soul isn't alive in the grave any more than the body is. The person who's the combination of a body and soul, which is really just one thing, not really a combination of two things, is dead and gone. At least until they're potentially, if they died in relationship with the Lord, reconstituted in a future resurrection. Psalms 94:17 says, Unless the Lord had been my help, my soul had almost dwelt in silence. The soul dwelling in silence is a Hebraic expression for the conditions of death in the grave, again testifying to the biblical understanding that the soul doesn't live on after the death of the person's physical body, but is the person whose body has died who goes into the silent state of non-existence. Psalms 97:10 says, Ye that love the Lord hate evil. He preserveth the souls of his saints. He delivereth them out of the hand of the wicked. When God protects a person from their enemies' attacks, he's preserving their soul, and thus protecting their soul from death. Psalms 116:3-9 says, The sorrows of death compassed me, and the pains of hell gat hold upon me. I found trouble and sorrow. Then called I upon the name of the Lord. O Lord, I beseech thee, deliver my soul. Gracious is the Lord, and righteous. Yea, our God is merciful. The Lord preserveth the simple. I was brought low, and he helped me. Return unto thy rest, O my soul, for the Lord hath dealt bountifully with thee. For thou hast delivered my soul from death, mine eyes from tears, and my feet from falling. I will walk before the Lord in the land of the living. If the human soul is inherently immortal, then it would be senseless to say that the Lord delivered your soul from death, since it supposedly can't die. But as I've said probably now more than 100 times, the Bible consistently describes the human soul as mortal, and its life able to be ended by other human beings, killing the person who is the soul. The last example I'll give you in the book of Psalms is in the 124th Psalm, verses 1-8, are a song of degrees of David. He said, If it had not been the Lord who was on our side, now may Israel say, If it had not been for the Lord who was on our side. When men rose up against us, then they had swallowed us up quick. When their wrath was kindled against us, then the waters had overwhelmed us. The stream had gone over our soul. Then the proud waters had gone over our soul. Blessed be the Lord, who hath not given us as a prey to their teeth. Our soul is escaped as a bird out of the snare of the fowlers. The snare is broken, and we are escaped. Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. Though this could refer to escaping negative conditions in general, the context implies this swallowing up of the soul is destructive in nature. And as we've seen through all these examples up to this point, and I'll give you more examples in the next session, the human soul is obviously not only mortal, meaning it will die and end its existence, but other human beings can bring about the death of the soul. But that does not change the promise of God that we will never die. Because as I said earlier, death to God is a permanent form of non-existence. And if the state we are in when we die is not a permanent state of non-existence, a permanent state of death, then it's not really death at all to the Lord God of heaven. Because all he has to do for one of his children who have died, and I mean died body and soul, died fully, and are laying there sleeping in death, is call them back into a state of conscious life. And thus to God they truly are just sleeping, even if from our finite perspective they are truly dead.